Okay, I'm just going to run through how to build some pivots because I know a few of you have been struggling a bit with this, and they are quite fiddly, so hopefully this will clear things up a little bit for you. Let me just get a tool out that I need. So what you see on the table here is what you get in a low roll centre LRC pivot set. So you get the front and rear pivots, which are actually screwed together and assembled. You'll see this thick, it's about 1/2 mil thick washer in the middle there. That's not needed in the assembly anywhere, it's just for packaging. So they assemble the pivots together with that washer, just for transit. And you also get these two thin shims. These are 0.05 of a millimetre thick, so these are designed to go between the upper and lower housing to essentially space apart the ball cups that the pivot sits in, just in case it binds up or is a bit tight when you first assemble it. It's worth mentioning that pretty much every set of pivots I've ever built for this car have needed this shim to be fitted. So it's if you're not sure, it's probably advisable just to fit it. If anything, it will mean that the pivots have got a little bit more play in than you would desire, but it's better to have a bit of play than for them to be binding up and too tight. So if I take these apart, the tools you'll need to do this, by the way, are a 2mm hex driver, this little spanner that you should have got in your A12X or A12WC kit. We use this end of it with these two little tabs to hold the pivot while we're tightening it up. And the other thing you'll need is a 7mm nut spinner. This one doesn't have it, but it's better if there's no chamfer on the inside edge of this. If it's just got a flat bottom, generally it's more useful to get, because the nuts on these pivots are very low profile and thin. So yeah, if you can get a 7mm nut spinner that's just got a flat face to it rather than a chamfer lead-in, then you'll probably have a slightly easier time of it. So if I just take these apart. So I'm just going to discard this thick washer that comes with it. Don't need that. So as you can see, there's 3 bits to it. You've got the main pivot ball, looks like that. There's a long one for the front pivot and a short ball stud for the rear pivot. And you've got the nut that looks like that. And then the housing that goes underneath the main chassis that looks like this. You'll see there's 2 very small little tabs on either side of it, and that's what we're going to put this little spanner, use this little spanner for, to hold when they're in the chassis. So you build the pivots onto, this is the main chassis of an A12X car, but it's got the same pivot counterboard hole feature on the A12WC as well. So the first thing to do is just take this piece with the small notches in it, and on the underside of the chassis, just drop this into the hole. Hopefully you heard that little snap there. That was just as it socketed into that little counter bore that's in there. So it's kind of a light press fit, I would say. Shouldn't be loose. Hopefully it doesn't drop out. So then turn it over. Actually, I've put that in the wrong end. This is a front pivot, so I'll just take this one apart because I want the short pivot ball for this one. So then just take your pivot ball what I'm actually going to do here as well is just put a tiny amount of copper grease in the assembly. So I'll just smear that around like that. So this is MR33 copper grease, but you can get MXLR stuff, or there's various brands that do it. It's all pretty much the same stuff. So I'm just going to drop that ball into the housing like that, and then take my nut. So you'll see that it's kind of a top hat shaped nut, so you want the thread to go down onto the chassis so that the nut is on the top. So just drop that on there. I'm just pressing on the cap on the underside with my thumb just to stop that spinning in the chassis, and then just use my thumb to tighten that up. So you'll see I've done this without a shim in it. So if I tighten that up, that's only thumb tight, so it's not fully tight yet, but already I can feel that the ball stud is a little bit tight in that housing. So basically, as I previously mentioned, I'd advise that you just fit the shim in here as standard. And it's quite simple to do. You just take the shim and slide it over the top. Try and get it roughly centrally positioned, and then the threaded portion of the nut should go through the middle of that shim. So try and be careful not to get the edge of the shim caught up in the thread, because that will bind up the pivot and mean that it doesn't work properly. So try and be a bit careful here, because the shim is very thin and fragile as well. So once it's in there, it'll be okay, but it can be a bit tricky. So that's finger tight now, and already it's a much freer, looser fit. Now, I previously mentioned with the 7mm driver, it will help if it doesn't have a chamfered lead into it, help you get onto the nut. So if I try this driver on here, it's only just, I mean, it's not really picking up on the corner of the nut there at all. So I'm going to grab a different driver to do this with. So this one's still has a lead in, but slightly less so. So the hex in the driver actually starts right on the edge of this driver. So this should be a better one to use. Now, basically all you need to do is tighten this nut up to clamp the pivot together and complete the assembly. The problem you'll have is that as you try and tighten that nut up, what it will do is try and spin this insert on the underside of the chassis, so you won't be able to get it fully tight. And I think some of the problems a few of you have been having with these pivots coming undone have been due to the fact that you haven't tightened them up fully. So there's a couple of things to do that can combat that. The first one is to use this spanner. So you can see the two little tabs on it, and they actually just slot into those two little recesses under there, and then you can use the spanner like that to hold that insert in place while you tighten the nut from the other side. What you could also do, just as a belt and braces option, is put ever such a tiny amount of blue thread lock. This is associated stuff that I've had in my box for forever and a day, but you can get this from anywhere. Loctite blue stuff. There's a kind of a Pritt stick version of this that's a little bit easier to apply, doesn't run everywhere. But when I say you need a small amount, I mean it needs to be like a tiny pinhead amount, because you don't want to get thread lock inside the pivot, so you just want to keep it on the threads if you can. And yeah, use fairly low strength stuff. Blue stuff is usually fairly low strength, because there will be a time when you want to get these pivots undone again, to rebuild them or service them. So hopefully I can do this in a way that you can see. Just going to slide that spanner into the pivot sockets and then come at it from behind with my nut spinner and just nip that up tight. Try the pivot again. It's got a nice bit of movement. If I try and pull it out of the housing and push it in, there's very little play there, so it's actually a very nice pivot build. Basically repeat that for the forward pivot, and then you'll have your chassis plate with 2 pivots in it, and that screws onto the chassis. So I'll just quickly build the second one up, and then I'll show you how it needs to be attached to the main chassis. So drop that. So that insert in there was a little bit of a looser fit, so I'm just going to have to put my index finger behind it, stop it dropping out. Bit of copper grease. Drop that in there with a shim. As you can see, it's a little bit fiddly just to get that shim lined up over the hole. Drop the nut on. I think yeah, the trick here is to try and be delicate when you're assembling it and getting it finger tight. If you're too forceful with it, then you'll probably get the shim trapped inside the thread or in the housing, which will not be helpful. You can do a quick visual check just to see that the shim's properly aligned. It should be roughly uniform, showing through past the nut there, you can see. If it's off to one side, then it probably means it's caught up, so check it and do it again if you need to. Stick this in here, get my nut spinner. It needs to be tight, but don't over tighten it because the threads are very delicate. So I'm just moving that pivot there, and that's a little bit tight, even with a shim in it. Moving it around, it's starting to free off a bit. It might have just been the grease packed in there that's affected it a little bit. It still feels a bit tight, so I think I'm going to put a second shim in there. Bear with me a moment, I'll find one. Okay, dug out another shim, so I'm just going to undo this nut. As you can see, if I just try and spin the nut, you can see the housing spins inside the chassis there, so I just need this spanner to hold that again while I undo it. What you can do for easier installation of the shim is actually put the shims over the nut like this. Go back in. Okay, so now we've got 2 shims in there, and that's much better. Good. Okay, so there we are, chassis with 2 pivots on. Now we need to offer it up to the car. So here's a car that's basically assembled with everything except the outer chassis and pivots on it. So what I'll do is just take these screws out of the pod here. Okay, so the other things you'll need to fit this are a 1.5mm shim that should be in the kit. That just drops into the recess at the front of the suspension plate there. And what you also need is a cone shaped washer, which hopefully I have one somewhere. So you need one of these, which is, I can't remember the part number, but it's like a beveled washer. You can just see in the camera there, it's got a slight cone feature to it. So it's flat on one side and coned on the other. So you want the cone side to face the pivot when you just drop that on there. Okay, and that just stops the pivot binding up with the spacer or the surface it's mounted to. Now the next thing is the manual tells you that you should fit a 0.25 shim under each pivot. That basically makes the chassis flat relative to the battery tray. But what we like to do is lift the battery tray up a little bit relative to the outer chassis. So to do that, we can modify the shimming that we put front and rear. So while the kit says 0.25 front and back, what I have been running is 0 in the front and a 0.5 mil shim in the rear. And that just kicks the battery tray up at an angle relative to the outer chassis. So you don't have to preload the rear spring quite so much. So I'm just going to dig out a shim quickly. So I've got 1/2 mil shim just here, so I'll drop that over this rear pivot. You don't need the weird cone shaped shim in the rear pivot, it's only in the front one that you need that. Okay, so now I've got my chassis built with my pivots and my shim arrangement that I want. I've got the spacer in the front of the chassis there. Now the easiest way to do this is as I've got it on the camera now, so with the car upside down on the table in front of you, and then just hold the outer chassis and put a finger over each pivot to stop all the shims dropping off, and then just turn it upside down, line it up, and drop it on. It's a little bit fiddly, but once you've got it lined up it's pretty good. And then just use a 2mm driver into the pivot like that. Now I would kind of do each one up a little bit at a time, just so it goes down evenly. Get it to a point where it's just finger tight, and just check that you've got the movement that you expect. It's probably best to do this without side springs on the car. If you take the side springs off, then this will be really floppy and you should immediately be able to see if it's binding up at all. I'm fairly confident this won't be, because I've checked the pivots as I built them. So once you're happy with all that and the alignment, just nip these screws up like so, and there you have it. Then obviously the pod, which has often got a motor attached to it, comes in and screws on the back of the car. So that is how you build pivots, specifically low roll centre ones, and attach the outer chassis to the car. Hope that's helpful.